Now, we have 20 minutes at least for questions and answers. If I could ask you, if you wish to ask a question, to identify yourself, and I will take groups of 3 questions. If you would just indicate in the normal way whether you wish to speak, there is a microphone that we will bring to you so it can be recorded for posterity.
Peter Kennedy from the NZIIA. This is a question for Professor Fowles. Traditionally, there have been much lower turnouts for European elections in almost all member states, except I think Poland, but certainly in Britain, than for national elections. Is there not a fear that for this referendum on Europe, there would be a very low turnout? And is it proposed, do you know if it's proposed that the hundreds of thousands or whatever there are British in the rest of the EU would be entitled to vote in the referendum and presumably would vote for staying?
Stuart McMillan of the NZIIA. In David Cameron's own words, he's going to devolve a huge amount of power to Scotland. What I wonder is whether that transfer of power will feed the ambitions of other regions within the European Union. So it's one question. The other question is, which regions?
Vincent Gray, International Affairs, it's really a question of asking an opinion. Is it not true that the reason why Great Britain and Europe are united is because of political reasons, namely war? That as soon as the danger of war seems to go, what happens is that they break up for economic reasons. Now, in Britain, it has long been true that the north is poorer than the south. And they seem to get away with it for a long time by voting Labour in the north and running the government, even though they were poorer. Now they've decided they really want to get out altogether. Now, much the same thing has happened in Europe, because the southern, Spain, Italy, Portugal and Greece are poorer than the rest, and now they see that they cannot really integrate with Europe. And well, the question I really want to ask is not this change that we're seeing something that is inevitable?
Good evening. There are many people around the world with British passports and dual citizenship. Given that this would affect their rights to work in many different countries, do you see the referendum being extended to all British passport holders?
Well, I guess this addresses both the first and the last question. Normally, you would expect to see a lower turnout in such a referendum because it's not. I suppose it will probably be concurrent with local elections, which is usually what happens in these cases. So, but then turnout in local elections is not normally as high. So you would expect low turnout, and if the issue of Europe is less salient to ordinary people, then you might expect a lower turnout, and the risk is, of course, that those who are most opposed will have the strongest views and might vote. You can get around those sorts of questions constitutionally by saying that there has to be some kind of a supermajority of some form, but I doubt that. I don't think there's precedent for that in the UK. As far as people outside the UK voting, you can, if you're outside the UK, you can vote in UK elections for 15 years after having left the country. So to the extent that applies to British passport holders around the world, and indeed in Europe, then presumably that will also be the case.
In 1975, there was a referendum on Europe. It wasn't held at the same time as local elections, as it happens. There was a 67% yes vote on a 65% turnout. And they've talked up to this point about having the referendum before the end of 2017. So, and Jack's absolutely right that we've had previous referendum on the same day as local elections. Last year, the Scottish one was in September. So that's an indicator, but quite a distant one. There will have to be legislation to bring in a referendum, and it's that legislation that normally sets the rules about who can vote. So in the Scottish referendum, 16-year-olds were allowed to vote. That was legislated for, but it was only residents in Scotland. And there were plenty of Scots in London who were a bit angry about that. So it will rather depend on the legislation for the referendum, whether the same law that applies as the professor sets out correctly around national elections will be applied for the referendum as well. For the Scottish referendum, some of the push in Catalonia went backwards. There was a court that ruled that their moves towards to have a referendum were illegal. I don't know where that sits right now, but that's the obvious other country where there has been particularly powerful region or yearning for regional representation. And the point about being united through war and perhaps split economically, and is this sort of split inevitable? I mean, just using the UK example, if you think about the early 1970s, which weren't the greatest time for the UK economically, one of the reasons for us joining was that Europe was doing very well and we weren't. So there was a very strong economic impulse behind the reason to join Europe. And if you look at countries through the 70s and 80s that joined Europe, the sort of injection from single market, the injection from state aid that came towards helping those regions that were only a certain percentage of the average income across Europe was quite tremendous. So you've got plenty of countries that have benefited hugely from being part of Europe. The tension has come over the last 5 years and primarily arises from, well, all sorts of reasons, but debt is one of them. Debt is probably the primary reason. And I think you can see politically there's a huge impetus to ensure that the Eurozone stays together. So, yes, it's been tough, but my sense is that right now, as Michal has said, growth figures are going in the right direction, even in parts where it's been particularly tough, like Spain. So I think the next few years are more hopeful than the last few.